It's January 1986. The bright Florida sun looks a little pale this morning. A crowd has gathered at the Kennedy Space Center. Eyes fixed on the sky, everyone held their breath for the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. But there was something they couldn't see, a secret. Inside that gigantic shuttle as it soared into the sky was a great tragedy. A thin layer of ice on the launch pad had not gone unnoticed. The freezing temperatures of the previous day had left a question mark in the minds of the engineers. Could this cold be dangerous to the shuttle? But time was running out. The decision had been made. The mission would proceed. No one could have predicted that this decision would make history. The countdown has begun. The tension in the atmosphere is palpable. Space enthusiasts are glued to their TV sets. Ignition! The Challenger's massive engines fired, and the shuttle began its slow ascent into the sky. Everyone's eyes were focused on the line of white smoke rising into the sky, but there was an unseen danger growing. The seal on the right solid rocket motor, a small but critical part, had begun to crack under the relentless impact of the cold air. No one noticed. The Challenger was miles above the ground. In the control room, everything seemed fine. But one of the ground crew noticed a change in the smoke plume from the engines. "The smoke looks different," he said in a whisper. The others quickly dismissed the observation. The mission continued. Meanwhile, the seal on the right rocket engine had completely separated, and the intense pressure began to dangerously release the fuel inside the shuttle. Challenger was now in a race against time, but no one realized it. Exactly 73 seconds after launch, everything changed. The shuttle suddenly turned into a ball of fire. White smoke mixed with a black explosion in the sky. At first, people couldn't understand what had happened. A child's voice could be heard in the audience. "Is this how it should be?" Silence. "We lost the shuttle," whispered an engineer, expressing the gravity of the tragedy. Subsequent revelations showed that this tragedy was not just a technical error. Negligence, hasty decisions, and the human factor had brought Challenger to its end. In the shadow of a cold morning, humanity lost not just a shuttle, but a piece of its faith in science. The story of Challenger has gone down in history as the most painful example of how big dreams that soar into the sky can turn into tragedy. But it was also a warning. As science and technology advance, we must never forget to learn from human mistakes. Today I'm going to tell you about one of the most tragic moments in history, the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster of 1986, which was supposed to be a success story for science and humanity, but unfortunately turned out to be a terrible disaster. Introduction. Questions behind the failure Challenger was an important part of NASA's Space Shuttle program, and this mission was supposed to be a great success story. But just 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle was blown apart. So why did this disaster occur? Why did such a tragedy occur with all the preparation and technology? First technical problem: O-ring seal. The main technical cause of the disaster was the failure of a small part in the right solid rocket motor, called the O-ring seal. This seal was designed to prevent the escape of hot gases trapped by high pressure inside the engine. But the night before launch, the air temperature had dropped below zero, causing the seal to lose its elasticity. The cold weather caused the O-ring to weaken beyond design limits. During launch, the seal failed to prevent fuel from escaping, causing the rocket to explode. The human factor: ignored warnings. It is important to note, however, that this engineering problem was already known. NASA engineers and the company that designed the part had previously warned that the O-rings might not be reliable in cold weather. However, these warnings were ignored due to the pressure of the mission schedule and public expectations. NASA was under immense pressure to launch the shuttle on time. This pressure led to safety compromises. 3. Errors in the decision-making process. Another major cause of the disaster was poor decision-making. In pre-launch meetings, some engineers had pointed out the risks associated with the O-rings. However, managers did not take these concerns seriously enough. A mission plan is more important mentality drowned out the engineers' voices. This is one of the most tragic examples of how a breakdown in corporate communication and poor decision-making can lead to tragic consequences. Fourth, cold weather factor. The weather conditions on the day of departure also contributed to this tragedy. It was an unseasonably cold January morning in Florida. The temperature was below zero, which affected not only the O-rings, but also other parts of the rocket. It was obvious that the launch should not have taken place in these conditions, but the launch program was not postponed. The consequences of this event were felt far and wide, from space exploration to engineering safety to human psychology. 1. Human loss and psychological effects. The most painful consequence was the loss of life of 7 crew members, 7 brave people. It was a traumatic experience for their families and for the millions of people around the world who watched this historic moment. The death of teacher Krista McAuliffe, in particular, caused deep sadness and disappointment in the education community. The live coverage of the event magnified the impact of the tragedy. Viewers experienced an emotional divide between disappointment and shock. 2. Impact on NASA and space programs. The Challenger disaster was a major blow to NASA. Confidence in the space agency was severely shaken. Public and government support for NASA waned, and some even questioned the future of the space program. In the wake of the disaster, NASA suspended all Space Shuttle missions and began a comprehensive review. While the wreckage of Challenger and the remains of the crew were recovered, it took years to analyse the failures in detail. The Space Shuttle program was suspended for 2.5 years during this period. 3. Engineering and safety reforms. The disaster led to fundamental changes in engineering and safety processes. NASA made serious changes to the Space Shuttle design. One of the most important reforms was a complete overhaul of the design of the solid rocket motors, particularly the O-ring seals. NASA's risk management policies and decision-making processes were also revised. Security measures were strengthened, and a more transparent approach to communication was adopted. These reforms laid the foundation for a safety culture that would last until the Columbia disaster in 2003. 4. Impact on public opinion and education. Challenger represented not only a space mission, but also the world of education. Krista McAuliffe was to be the first teacher in space, and the event was seen as an inspiration to combine education and science. Her death put that vision on hold for a short time. However, many education and science programs have since been launched in McAuliffe's name. Revived interest in STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics, fields in education, and stimulated interest in space exploration among younger generations. 5. Impact on the future of space exploration. Challenger once again highlighted the risks of space exploration. This tragedy reminded us that pushing the frontiers of science and technology comes with great responsibility. Space missions were subject to more planning and oversight. This has made for safer, but slower, progress. 6. Perspectives on human spaceflight. This incident called into question the risks of human spaceflight. It sparked a public debate about the need for space missions and what it means to risk human life. The lessons of Challenger became a guide not only for NASA, but for all space agencies around the world. The Challenger disaster claimed many lives and opened a deep wound in human history, but the most painful part is that this tragedy could have been prevented. If the right precautions had been taken, we would not be telling the story of this disaster today. 1. Take safety warnings seriously. The most important step was to heed the warnings of the engineers. Before Challenger was launched, there were warnings that the O-ring seals on the right rocket engine would not work in cold weather. However, these warnings were ignored due to the pressure of the launch date. Had these warnings been taken seriously, the launch could have been delayed and the seal problem solved. 2. Safety prioritised decision-making processes. Another critical issue was the need to reprioritise decision-making. NASA was under enormous pressure to meet the mission schedule and public expectations. But safety must always come first. Had NASA prioritised safety instead of succumbing to that pressure, Challenger's launch could have been delayed to a safer day. 3. More rigorous technical inspections. There should have been stricter controls in the design and testing process to prevent disaster. There was insufficient testing of the performance of the O-ring seals at low temperatures. Had such tests been conducted, the cold weather risks could have been identified in advance. More simulation and environmental testing could have solved this problem long before launch. 4. More careful consideration of weather conditions. The temperature on launch day was unseasonably cold, even for Florida. Launching in such extreme conditions was risky. Had NASA considered these weather conditions a more serious threat, the launch could have been postponed. Consideration of weather conditions in space missions is part of safety and should not have been ignored. 5. Develop a culture of communication and accountability. The Challenger disaster was also the result of communication failures. Engineers' concerns about risks were not fully communicated to senior management. A more open culture of communication could have prevented such critical information from being ignored. It was also critical to increase accountability and create an environment where everyone's voice could be heard. The impact of the Challenger disaster was deep and far-reaching, but the tragedy did not completely destroy humanity's faith in space exploration. On the contrary, it was a warning to proceed more carefully, more safely, and more deliberately. To honour the memory of those who lost their lives, Challenger left a legacy that reminds us that safety and responsibility must always be paramount.